Gentlemen, today we're talking about something society doesn't fully understand: why extended solitude in a man's life doesn't weaken him, it sharpens him. This isn't about bitterness or giving up on love. It's about what happens when a man uses his solitude to grow, not decay. Let's break it down. When a man spends a significant amount of time single, one of the first and most transformative changes he undergoes is learning to be emotionally independent. At first, this might feel like loneliness. There's a void that many men, especially those who were once in relationships or constantly surrounded by social interaction, feel when they first find themselves alone. But if he leans into that discomfort instead of running from it, if he doesn't numb it with temporary distractions like casual flings, endless entertainment, or substance use, he begins to tap into a source of inner strength that few ever develop. Emotional independence isn't just about not needing a partner to feel okay. It's about becoming so in tune with your own thoughts, emotions, and psychological patterns that you're no longer a slave to them. He learns how to process his feelings on his own. He confronts his past traumas without projecting them onto others. He starts to understand why he reacts the way he does in certain situations: anger, jealousy, fear, sadness. And instead of outsourcing those emotions for someone else to fix or validate, he learns how to sit with them, examine them, and ultimately control them. That's not weakness. That's a man who is emotionally self-regulating, and that kind of strength is rare. In the silence of solitude, when there's no partner there to provide comfort, encouragement, or a sense of identity, a man is forced to look inward. He starts to ask himself the deep, uncomfortable questions most people avoid. Who am I without someone to love me? What do I actually want? What parts of me are genuine and what parts are performative? Just attempts to be liked or accepted. This kind of introspection leads to a rebirth. He no longer lives for approval, attention, or emotional safety nets. He starts living for truth, and in that truth he finds power. When he finally becomes emotionally independent, he doesn't need to hear "I love you" every night to feel valuable. He doesn't need someone to constantly reassure him that he's enough. He doesn't panic when he's misunderstood or when someone disapproves of him. He no longer seeks to prove himself in every interaction. He knows who he is, and that's enough. That kind of centered, emotionally grounded energy is rare and intimidating, especially in a world that trains men to be emotionally reactive or codependent. Most people have no idea how to handle a man who is no longer afraid of his own company, who doesn't crumble when he's emotionally challenged, and who doesn't chase external comfort to regulate his internal storms. Women pick up on this energy almost instinctively. Emotional independence in a man creates a calm, powerful presence. He doesn't overreact. He doesn't beg. He doesn't need to be needed. That's unsettling for anyone who's used to relationships filled with emotional drama, neediness, or volatility. But for a woman who's mature and emotionally secure herself, it's deeply attractive. And for those who thrive on manipulation or emotional control, it's a nightmare, because nothing is more threatening to that dynamic than a man who can walk away at any moment, not out of bitterness or arrogance, but because his peace is more important than validation. This man, the emotionally independent man, is no longer ruled by the highs and lows of attachment. He may love deeply, but he never loves blindly. He may care, but he doesn't collapse. And most of all, he's free. Not just free from others, but free from the parts of himself that used to sabotage him. His need to please, to be liked, to feel wanted at any cost. That freedom, once tasted, becomes sacred. And the longer he remains single, the more that independence sharpens, until it becomes one of the most unshakable foundations of his masculinity. When a man remains single for an extended period, and especially when he embraces that season of solitude intentionally, something profound begins to happen. He starts building a life centered around purpose rather than people. This is one of the most powerful shifts a man can experience because it reorients his entire identity and sense of self-worth. Most people, often unknowingly, build their lives around relationships. Their moods, decisions, and even ambitions are shaped by who is in their life and how those people perceive them. But a man who is single long enough, who no longer has to accommodate the emotional gravity of someone else's presence, gains the rare opportunity to recalibrate his life around something deeper and far more enduring, his mission. Purpose is not something that simply lands in a man's lap. It's not found in a single moment of inspiration, but rather forged over time through introspection, pain, failure, exploration, and discipline. And solitude gives him the space to begin that process. Without constant emotional entanglements or distractions, he begins to think more deeply about his role in the world. He questions what he wants to leave behind, what legacy he hopes to build, and what truth he's willing to sacrifice for. These questions are not easily answered, and they can't be answered when a man is constantly reacting to someone else's needs or emotions. Solitude gives him the mental bandwidth to wrestle with these existential questions in a real, grounded way. As he builds his life around purpose, his routine begins to change. He wakes up with clarity and direction. Instead of scrolling aimlessly through social media or texting multiple people just to feel relevant, he's planning his next move, whether it's a business idea, a physical transformation, a skill he wants to master, or a long-term goal he's finally serious about achieving. His time becomes sacred. His energy is no longer scattered across fleeting connections and surface-level validation. Every hour has weight. Every decision is aligned with a bigger picture. This kind of focus can be intimidating to people who are used to being the center of someone's universe. When a man lives for his purpose, he doesn't cancel his goals just because someone demands more of his attention. He doesn't bend over backward to accommodate emotional whims that don't align with his mission. This doesn't mean he's cold or indifferent. It means he's structured. He's living with direction, and that structure makes him immune to the kind of emotional chaos that destroys unfocused men. He doesn't fall apart over rejection or ghosting. Why? Because he's already committed to something bigger than himself. And here's the truth. People respect a man who's busy building something. It may frustrate them, it may challenge them, but it commands a level of admiration that no amount of charm or good looks ever could. Women, in particular, can sense when a man is consumed by a higher calling. There's a gravity to him. He's not overly available. He's not easily swayed. He's not emotionally flailing for attention. That sense of being anchored in purpose is magnetic. It creates intrigue, it creates respect, and most importantly, it sets the terms of engagement. If someone wants to be part of his life, they must fit into the purpose he's already moving toward, not distract him from it. Over time, his identity becomes less and less dependent on his relationship status. He no longer thinks, "I'll be happy when I find the right person." That's not his timeline. His happiness isn't delayed, it's active. He wakes up fulfilled, not because someone loves him, but because he's chasing something meaningful. That's where true confidence comes from, not fake bravado, not surface-level swagger, but the quiet, unshakable knowledge that you are doing exactly what you're meant to be doing, regardless of who recognizes it or not. And the longer he walks this path alone, the more resilient he becomes. Life throws distractions, temptations, and emotional traps in his way, but he sidesteps them, not out of fear, but because he's laser-focused. He doesn't chase, he doesn't beg, and he doesn't compromise his values for temporary comfort. Purpose becomes his compass. And when a man builds his life around that, he becomes virtually untouchable, not because he's heartless, but because his heart is committed to something far greater than himself. When a man remains single for an extended period, one of the most powerful shifts that occurs within him is the development of discernment. He becomes highly selective, not desperate. This transformation isn't about arrogance or being overly critical. It's about finally understanding his value on a deep, unshakable level. Early in life or in earlier relationships, many men approach dating from a place of emotional hunger. They want to be chosen, to feel wanted, to be loved, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But when a man is single long enough to break free from the compulsion to chase companionship, he begins to realize that not every connection deserves his energy. He stops settling, not because he thinks he's better than everyone, but because he finally knows what he brings to the table and what it costs to share that with the wrong person. This shift in mindset leads to a redefinition of what he's even looking for. When he was younger or less experienced, attraction may have been enough. Physical beauty, surface-level charm, or temporary chemistry might have been all it took to spark interest. But time alone gives him the clarity to look beneath the surface. He begins to recognize that beauty without character is a liability, that charm without consistency is manipulation, that chemistry without shared values leads to destruction. So he stops wasting time on connections that don't align with his deeper truth. He stops ignoring red flags. He stops rationalizing bad behavior. And most importantly, he stops compromising his standards just to avoid being alone. Being selective means understanding that compatibility is more than just feelings. It's about lifestyle alignment, emotional intelligence, vision, and values. A man who's been single long enough knows that a relationship is not a prize, it's a partnership. He's not looking for someone to complete him because he's already whole. He's looking for someone who complements the life he's already built. That standard eliminates a large percentage of people right out of the gate. And he's okay with that. He'd rather have fewer options and peace of mind than endless options and emotional chaos. What makes this selectiveness dangerous, in the best way, is that it removes the leverage most people unconsciously use in modern dating, the fear of being alone. The man who's comfortable in solitude cannot be manipulated through scarcity. He's not in a rush. He doesn't panic when a situation doesn't work out. He doesn't beg to be understood, loved, or chosen. If something doesn't align, he walks away, not out of ego, but out of principle, and that terrifies people who are used to being able to control men through beauty, sex, or emotional neediness. People don't know how to handle a man who doesn't flinch when left on read, who doesn't chase after being ghosted, who doesn't get emotionally derailed when a connection fades. This man simply adjusts. He redirects his focus back to his purpose. He recalibrates without losing himself. That's not indifference, it's mastery, and it only comes from spending enough time alone to realize that peace is more valuable than attention, that standards protect his soul, that his time is his most sacred asset. This kind of selectiveness also sharpens his ability to detect authenticity. He becomes a reader of energy, of intention. Words don't impress him as easily. He's not fooled by performance. He watches how someone carries themselves when they're not trying to impress. He pays attention to how they handle conflict, how they treat people who can't offer them anything, and how consistent they are over time. That's the criteria he uses to evaluate people, not how they make him feel in the moment, but who they consistently are when no one is watching. And the beauty of this transformation is that once a man reaches this level of discernment, he becomes nearly impossible to fool. He doesn't fall into toxic cycles because he's not chasing validation. He's not entering relationships out of boredom or fear. He's not seeking emotional anesthesia. Every decision he makes is conscious, deliberate, and aligned with long-term peace. He knows that it's better to be single and centered than committed and miserable. And because of that, he holds the line. He says no often. He walks away easily, and he refuses to negotiate with his standards, because he knows what it costs to build them in the first place. When a man remains single for a long period, especially one spent in intentional solitude rather than unconscious isolation, he inevitably begins to master self-control and discipline. This is not something that happens overnight. It's a slow, often painful transformation that comes from constantly confronting the urges, impulses, and distractions that most people indulge in without question. A man who chooses this path is not just staying single. He's undergoing a process of refinement, where his greatest weapon becomes his ability to say no. And in a world that rewards instant gratification and punishes restraint, that ability becomes incredibly rare and dangerously powerful. Most people live in reaction mode. They feel a desire and they act on it. They get a notification and they check it. They feel lonely and they seek out connection, no matter how shallow. They're constantly chasing the next hit of dopamine, the next hookup, the next compliment, the next drink, the next purchase, the next distraction. But a man who remains single long enough and chooses to remain intentional about his path starts to separate himself from that cycle. He begins to observe his cravings without being ruled by them. He notices the urge to reach out to someone just because he feels alone, and he sits with it instead. He feels the temptation to numb his pain through escapism, and he resists it. In doing so, he builds something that cannot be bought or faked: internal control. Discipline doesn't just mean sticking to a workout plan or waking up early. It means mastering your inner world, and this mastery shows up in every aspect of a man's life. When he's tempted by unhealthy relationships, he remembers his standards. When he's pulled toward laziness, he remembers his goals. When he's seduced by short-term pleasure, he remembers the long-term consequences. That ability to delay gratification, to resist the urge for quick comfort in favor of long-term growth, is what separates average men from exceptional ones. And it's not glamorous. It's not always visible. It's forged in private moments of decision where no one is watching and no one is applauding. Over time, this discipline becomes his default. He no longer negotiates with himself over basic commitments. He doesn't need motivation every morning because he's built structure. He doesn't crumble when life gets hard because his strength wasn't built in comfort. It was built in resistance, and that strength begins to radiate from him. People can feel it. They may not be able to put it into words, but they sense the difference. He's not reactive. He's not easily swayed. He doesn't live at the mercy of his emotions or impulses. He's grounded, composed, deliberate. That's not common in today's world, and that's exactly why it commands respect. This mastery over self also reshapes how he moves in relationships. He doesn't chase connection out of insecurity. He doesn't say things just to be liked. He doesn't compromise his values to avoid conflict. He doesn't engage in games or emotional manipulation. His emotional discipline allows him to stay centered, even when others are trying to provoke or test him. He doesn't need to prove himself because he already knows who he is, and that knowledge came from hundreds of small, quiet moments where he chose the harder path, not the easier one. What makes this self-control so powerful is that it's unshakable. It's not rooted in fear or repression. It's rooted in clarity and self-respect. He's not avoiding pleasure because he's afraid of it. He's choosing when and how to engage with it on his own terms. That's real power. That's sovereignty over one's own life, and it's not something anyone can give him. It's something he has to earn through consistent, disciplined living. Every time he says no to something beneath his standards, every time he chooses growth over comfort, he reinforces his identity as a man of control, not chaos. And this discipline starts to spill into everything. His finances become more structured, his health improves, his circle of friends gets tighter, more aligned, his environment becomes more ordered. He stops tolerating the kind of distractions and dysfunction that used to feel normal. He begins to build a life that reflects his inner discipline, a life of intention, of clarity, of quiet power. Because when a man masters self-control, the world no longer controls him. His cravings, his past, other people's expectations, none of it owns him anymore. He becomes his own master, and that changes everything. When a man remains single long enough, especially while focused on growth and inner development, he naturally sharpens his ability to observe human behavior with clarity and detachment. He begins to see people, not just through the lens of attraction or emotional longing, but through the lens of truth. He develops a deep psychological awareness that most people never access because they are too caught up in the noise of constant interaction and emotional dependency. This period of solitude acts like a mirror, reflecting back not only his own patterns, but also the patterns of others. He becomes a student of character, not words. A man who has been single long enough learns to read people, what motivates them, what wounds drive them, what masks they wear, and this discernment becomes one of his greatest assets. At first, this awareness can be overwhelming. He starts to notice how much of what people say is actually rooted in insecurity or manipulation. He sees how many relationships operate on unspoken agreements of codependence, transactional affection, and emotional avoidance. He becomes acutely aware of the difference between authenticity and performance. Where once he might have been seduced by charm, by flattery, by surface-level compatibility, he now digs deeper. He's no longer impressed by a curated personality or a pretty face. He wants to know what's behind the mask. What drives this person? Are they self-aware? Are they emotionally grounded? Are they capable of accountability? These are the questions he asks, not out loud, but internally, as he silently assesses who deserves access to his inner world. This level of insight doesn't come from bitterness or cynicism. It comes from presence. He has spent so much time with himself, observing his own thought patterns, unpacking his own traumas, analyzing his own behaviors, that he can now spot the same things in others without even trying. He sees when someone is projecting. He notices when someone is seeking validation instead of connection. He understands when someone is trying to control through guilt or silence. He doesn't need to argue. He doesn't need to expose them. He simply recognizes what's happening, and in that recognition, he protects his peace. This detachment from emotional chaos becomes one of his greatest superpowers. He doesn't get pulled into drama because he sees it before it starts. He doesn't take things personally because he understands that most behavior is a reflection of the person acting, not the person receiving. He watches how people treat others, not just how they treat him. He notices how consistent their energy is over time. He doesn't fall for potential, he watches for patterns, and once he sees those patterns, he makes decisions without emotional confusion. If someone's behavior doesn't align with their words, he believes the behavior. If someone shows disrespect, he doesn't overanalyze it. He distances himself, not out of anger, but out of wisdom. Over time, this psychological insight transforms how he interacts with the world. He becomes a quiet observer, never reactive, never desperate for approval. People might even accuse him of being distant or hard to read, but that's only because he refuses to emotionally invest in what hasn't proven itself. He doesn't rush into connections. He doesn't overshare. He doesn't confuse chemistry with compatibility, and he certainly doesn't romanticize red flags. His ability to observe rather than absorb gives him an edge in every situation, personal, professional, and romantic. What makes this awareness especially rare is that it's rooted in compassion, not judgment. He understands that people are wounded, that most unhealthy behaviors stem from unhealed pain, but he also understands that compassion doesn't require participation. He can care from a distance. He can empathize without enabling. He's not in the business of fixing people anymore. He's in the business of protecting his peace. And to do that, he trusts what he sees. Not just the image someone projects, but the truth their behavior reveals. This skill becomes invaluable. It saves him from heartbreak. It saves him from wasted time. It saves him from emotional entanglements that drain his energy and distort his purpose. He no longer seeks to be understood by everyone because he knows that most people don't even understand themselves. He doesn't need to be liked by the masses because he values alignment over popularity. And as he sharpens this ability, his standards rise even higher, not out of pride, but because he realizes that peace, truth, and emotional stability are non-negotiables in his life. He refuses to sacrifice them for the illusion of connection. When a man remains single long enough, he inevitably discovers that peace becomes his default state, and once that happens, chaos becomes intolerable. He no longer craves constant stimulation, attention, or validation from external sources. He doesn't need a relationship to feel fulfilled, nor does he seek out drama just to feel something. What he values above all else is the quiet, steady, undisturbed energy that comes from being in control of his own space, time, and emotions. That peace becomes sacred to him. It's not just a nice feeling. It's the foundation of his entire life. And once a man has built his world around that sense of inner stillness, anything that threatens it is immediately noticeable and instinctively rejected. This doesn't mean he becomes cold or emotionally unavailable. On the contrary, his emotions become more refined, more precise, more intentional. Because he's no longer overwhelmed by noise and distraction, he can actually feel more deeply, but he also protects those feelings more fiercely. He doesn't allow just anyone to come into his life and disturb the balance he's cultivated. He's not willing to trade peace for passion, unless that passion is equally grounded. He's not interested in roller coaster relationships, where highs are followed by chaotic lows. He wants emotional consistency, not volatility. He wants a relationship that adds to his peace, not one that tests it at every turn. This shift often makes him appear detached or unemotional to people who are used to emotional volatility as a form of intimacy. But the truth is, he simply doesn't engage in emotional warfare anymore. He doesn't argue for the sake of being right. He doesn't raise his voice to prove a point. He doesn't play games to get a reaction. He communicates clearly, listens deeply, and sets boundaries without apology. That calm, measured energy is a product of time spent in solitude, of learning how to regulate his own nervous system, of facing his own demons without outsourcing his healing to another person. He's been through the storm and built shelter from within, so now he no longer fears being alone. He fears being with someone who feels like a storm. And because peace is now his home, dysfunction is immediately jarring. He recognizes toxic behavior, not just intellectually, but viscerally. His body responds to it. His intuition fires off like an alarm. The moment someone disrespects his time, manipulates his emotions, or tries to create confusion where there should be clarity, he feels it in his gut, and he acts on it, not with anger but with finality. He doesn't argue, he doesn't try to fix people. He doesn't wait around hoping things will get better. He just walks away, because he understands that once peace has been earned, it's too expensive to lose. This level of calm is intimidating to people who thrive on emotional chaos. They can't provoke him. They can't lure him into emotional highs and lows. They can't bait him into reacting. He simply doesn't respond to dysfunction anymore. He doesn't feed it. He doesn't entertain it. He outgrows it. That neutrality is often misunderstood as coldness, but in reality it's wisdom. He's not indifferent. He's discerning. He doesn't suppress his feelings. He controls how and when he expresses them. He's not emotionally unavailable. He's emotionally strategic. That distinction is everything. In this state, his energy becomes magnetic. People sense the peace he carries, even if they don't fully understand it. He's not trying to prove anything, and that alone makes him stand out. He's not chasing anything or anyone, and that creates an aura of stability that draws people in. But he's careful with that attention. He knows that not all energy is good energy. He filters carefully. He listens more than he speaks. He watches how people show up, not just when they want something, but consistently. Because he knows that anyone allowed into his life now has the power to either nurture or disturb the balance he's worked so hard to build. He becomes deeply intentional with everything: his words, his time, his space, his connections. He's not living reactively anymore. He's living from a place of grounded awareness. And while this might limit the number of people in his life, it dramatically increases the quality of those relationships. Every person in his circle brings peace, alignment, and mutual respect. There's no tension, no confusion, no emotional games, just clarity, depth, and connection rooted in mutual wholeness. Because a man who has made peace his foundation will never again settle for anything that costs him that peace. So in the end, the longer a man stays single, intentionally, purposefully, and with focus, the more he becomes a force unto himself. He learns to think clearly, move deliberately, and feel deeply without being controlled by those feelings. He masters his time, his habits, and his peace. He sees people for who they are, not who he wishes them to be. And most importantly, he learns to walk away from anything that threatens the life he's worked so hard to build. He's not hardened by solitude. He's sharpened by it. And when he finally chooses to let someone into his life, it's not out of need or fear of being alone. It's out of power, clarity, and the desire to share his peace, not surrender it. That kind of man isn't just single, he's sovereign.